I'd like to welcome you all. I'm Heather Topsick, Director of Research Collections at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to convene the second of 2 Brown Bag Lunch Zooms for our Library Artists in Residence program. Today, we'll be hearing from Lissy Mineo-Gonzalez. A quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Lissy will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. For the question and answer session, please use the Q&A function. We do have a number of colleagues joining us as panelists, and for the panelists, I will remind you to use the raise hand function, and then I will call on you to unmute and ask your question. We also have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC option at the bottom of your screen. Though we are meeting virtually today, I would like to begin our gathering with a land acknowledgement. Bard Graduate Center respectfully acknowledges our presence in Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of Lenni Lenape, and recognizes New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many Indigenous people. In addition, we would like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these lands of their own free will, and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundation for our lives. Before introducing today's speaker in depth, I would like to share some background on the BGC Library's Artists in Residence program for those of you who are not yet familiar with it. Now in its 4th year, this program was developed as part of a wider institutional effort to bring artists in conversation with our gallery exhibitions and other institutional initiatives. The specific objective of the Library Air program, as we call it, is to invite visual or performing artists whose work is grounded in research to use our collections as an incubator for new work. Artists are invited to conduct research in subject areas relevant to their practice or to address the library itself as a concept or an institution, utilizing the library's reference staff as partners in this process. The resulting collaboration creates a unique opportunity for artists and librarians alike, while highlighting the distinctive aspects of our research library and expanding the Bard Graduate Center's relevance to a new audience. At this moment, we are halfway through the year's residency, which will culminate in an exhibition embedded into our library, which will open in mid-May, hopefully in person. Despite ongoing COVID restrictions, this year's artists, Jasmine Katasus and Lissy Mineo-Gonzalez, have managed to make regular research visits to our library this fall, and these works in progress talks are an opportunity for them to share their process and where they are in the projects. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Lissy Mineo-Gonzalez is a Dominican-born interdisciplinary artist inspired by the juxtaposition between urbanization and the natural world. Her relationship to this friction stems from the disparate environments occupied by herself and her family and her ancestors. Her themes explore the spectrum of ecofeminism, relationships between humans and non-human animals and plants, extinction, impermanence, and the intangibility of human consciousness. In 2020, Lissy was chosen to be an artist in residence at Alterwork Studios in partnership with Back to the Lab NYC. In 2021, Lissy exhibited her work at Alterwork Studios in Queens and Gallery Petite in Brooklyn. Her work is featured in Enfoco's online apartment gallery series exhibition Under Our Feet as Above Our Heads. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Lissy for her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Hola a todos. Happy Friday, Feliz Viernes. Thank you, Heather, for that introduction and the land acknowledgement. This talk would be extremely ironic without it. And thank you so much to all of you for joining in on a Friday. I want to start with a little bit about me. My name is Lissy, and I'm an alternative process photographer. Alternative processes is a term that houses a range of photo processes from the very beginnings of photography, like cyanotypes and Van Dyke brown prints, to the most experimental forms of printing and development that are still being discovered today. I explore this form of photography because my projects are largely driven by process. My first series that I exhibited was Take Only What You Need. My process with this project centered around using my graphic design skills because I majored in digital design for practical reasons, my alternative process knowledge at the time, and just wanting to use something other than a camera to take a photo. Each of these prints were composited by a lengthy process of scanning several individual sprigs one at a time, and then joining them together into one document to create an herb forest. At the time, I was in my last semester at the City College of New York, and my knowledge of alternative processes didn't expand much into the experimental. So these are Van Dyke brown prints. I use this process because even though it's not entirely friendly to the environment, there was something poetic about exposing these prints in sunlight and running them underwater and fixer to get to the final image. And using Van Dyke brown, I felt like I was able to mirror the conditions that gave life to the herbs themselves. But after this project, the irony of not being entirely sustainable stuck with me for a very long time and led me to exploring more sustainable printing practices. Then I found Chlorophyll Prints. It's a process where all you need are some digital negatives, a leaf, and a contact frame. With this process, I began to print things I love, beginning with my almost 18-year-old childhood dog, Toby. These prints take a couple of days of constant exposure to sunlight, and it varies greatly based on what type of a leaf you're using. The process uses the natural photosynthesis of a plant to expose an image, and after I make a print, I take so much comfort in knowing that eventually all these prints will biodegrade. This soul searching for discovering sustainable photo practices led me to my current project, La Matriarcha, or the matriarch in English. My research at the BGC library has pulled me in many different directions, and oftentimes has led me to one frustrating conclusion about my past, which is that I'll never be 100% certain of any of it. La Matriarcha is a project inspired by my maternal grandma, Cristina Jimenez. 3 years ago, I spent almost every single night sleeping at her bedside when she had a quadruple bypass surgery. She's back home in the Dominican Republic right now, but the fear of losing her then certainly led me to analyze where and who I come from. When I decided to do this project, I remembered a Chris Kraus quote that really resonated with me. No matter how dispassionate or large a vision of the world a woman formulates, whenever it includes her own experience and emotion, the telescopes turn back on her because emotion's just so terrifying, the world refuses to believe that it can be pursued as discipline, as form. My grandma was born in 1939. She lived through many Dominican revolutions. Growing up, my grandma was certain of one thing, and that was that she absolutely loves cities. She made it out of the campos, the rural areas of DR, and moved to the capital of Santo Domingo, which is where I was born. But that wasn't enough for her. The goal was making it to New York City with her family, and her ticket there was not learning English to pull off an arranged marriage. The ticket for her was the work she was capable of doing with her hands. My grandma was a seamstress in the garment district. She learned the trade from her mother and passed down that trade to my mother. Since I left DR at 24 days old, and here is my green card and the picture of me at 24 days old, I didn't get the opportunity to learn that trade. This personal loss of a trade that made my existence on today's Zoom meeting possible is strange to me, and it's amongst one of the first casualties from my family's emigration. Through this project, I'm hoping to reconnect with this past by learning how to sew from my matriarchs. I've wondered why this trade wasn't passed down to my generation, and there are several reasons. To name two, industry here is very different from back home. So there was more emphasis on STEM programs in school than home economics. So I couldn't learn how to sew in school. nor could I learn at home since I grew up in a large household. My mom worked full-time, so I rarely saw her, and my grandma ran all the household errands throughout the day. So I spent most all of my time with my uncle. At BGC, my research has mainly revolved around the native Tainos of Quisqueya. Quisqueya is the name I'll be using to refer to the island of DR and Haiti as a whole. Tainos, the natives of Quisqueya, have an amazingly rich culture. They were among the most densely settled societies in the Americas, with archaeological databases suggesting there were likely more than 1 million inhabitants on Quisqueya alone. They believed in multiple deities of both sexes. These deities were referred to as Zemis. Their main Zemis were a mother and son. Atabe, the goddess of the moon, tides, and springs, and Jukahu, the spirit of Juka and master of the sea. My family, on the other hand, adopted the Catholicism forced and coerced onto the native population. Because of this, my middle name, though they couldn't fit it on my green card, is Altagracia. Altagracia is a province on the eastern peninsula of the island. It was named after the Virgin of Altagracia, who is believed to be the protective and spiritual mother of all Dominicans. Back home, January 21st is a holiday where faithful Catholics visit the large cathedral in Iguazu and make promises to the Virgin in return for good health, employment, or healthy relationships. My mom took me and my brother to this cathedral when we were kids. And ironically, as Catholic as my family is, I was the only child who wasn't baptized. Our assimilation here meant a sudden restructuring of what our days looked like. As a single mom, my mom wasn't capable of maintaining 5 people with salary below the poverty line. So naturally, capitalism changed how she continued to exercise her faith. Religion and my name are other casualties of our emigration. Although I'm not Catholic, my family has historically taken part in Catholic rituals. Beyond saying bendición to my elders, which bendición, for anyone who doesn't know, is how we ask for blessings from our elders. I didn't experience any other Catholic rituals growing up. I also lost the pronunciation and accent marks over my name. My name is pronounced Lissy. The accent marks over both my last names were removed to conform to the English language. That sort of erasure is nuanced because it doesn't seem all that important to an English speaker, but to a Spanish speaker, it changes where the emphasis lies in a word. Along with that, I lost my mother's last name, Jimenez, so it could fit onto my green card, onto my passport, and I suppose on those Scantron sheets that we use in school. But back to Iguazu. Iguazu in my research was home to one of the largest caciques or chiefdoms for the Tainos. It was governed by a male chief first and then a woman chief who historians believe had authority over the entire peninsula, which at the time stretched into today's La Romana province. It was believed to also have been the point of entry for the Taino people that kayaked from their settlements along the Orinoco River in South America. But best of all, it's one of the only cities to keep its indigenous name. So it was interesting to me to learn that history was actively erased in Iguazu to change its geographic significance in favor of history written by the Spanish crown. And that's evident in looking at a picture of this large brutalist cathedral. For me, there also seems to be a covert act of oppression perpetrated by the Spanish patriarchy that conveniently conceals and indigenous matriarchs' accomplishments in the region. Taino inheritance happened to be matrilineal. Names and ranks were passed down from the mothers. Though my family doesn't practice this, matriarchs in my family are the glue that keeps my family together. They tend to provide a lot of emotional, labor-intensive, and financial support to multiple generations. My grandma did so when raising both my uncles, my aunt, my mom, my cousin, me and my brother, and several friends of the family through the decades. And at 82, she's amazingly still doing so today. In my application, I had the idea of creating cyanotype printed quilts using family mementos, but I couldn't find books on the experience of my enslaved Black ancestors. I was reading all these books that mentioned Tainos wore little to no clothes because of the Caribbean climate, which the couple books I read on quilt making described it as the complete opposite. Quilting originated for utilitarian purposes here in America to keep families warm. So what I was searching for was a dead end. I felt like I was searching for information in all the wrong places. But then I stumbled upon a book that mentioned cotton cloth was highly valued and produced by Tainos. They used cotton to create belts and naguas, or small aprons, to distinguish between societal rank and marital status. Learning that refocused my quilt idea. So now I'm focusing on attempting to recreate clothes that my grandma made me when I was younger. I'll still be printing cyanotype images of family mementos, but in the form of, or it will materialize in a form that represents the hard work my grandma used in getting me here. This act of sewing is a way for me to reclaim a part of my history that's been undervalued and lost to time. I'm also leaning towards possibly mixing in some naguas and belts to bring my contemporary experience together with my, together with objects that represent my Taino ancestry. And also I'll fortunately have help from my mom because I have absolutely no sewing experience. Now I want to explore the triad of cultures that make me Dominican in this residency because it's largely been a struggle for me to accept that some part of me was created because of colonization. So I admittedly wanted to focus on the indigenous and Black parts of my past, but all the books I've found at BGC are written based on colonizer accounts or written by the colonizers themselves. This is certainly not the library's fault. There's just not a single book in existence written by a Taino because at the time, Tainos did not have a written language. They communicated only by speech, ritual, and art. Learning this made me realize another thing I've lost is language. Though I am very proud, very, very proud that I speak Spanish, it's not the language of all my ancestors. In doing this project, I happened to find Diano Studies, an account on Instagram that provides classes online in both English and Spanish that are created by natives themselves. It has long been an assumption that Tainos were wiped out, but there has been a beautiful resurgence of families who have secretly kept Taino traditions alive on the island. Reading those articles provides me with a lot of hope that I'll one day be able to learn to speak Arawak language and reclaim that part of myself that was violently erased and suppressed. In my research, there are things that I didn't know I was searching for, but I'm glad I found. The first one being all the names inhabitants of Quisqueya have had for the island. Those are Bogio, Quisqueya, Santo Domingo, Española, Hispaniola, Haiti, and today's Dominican Republic and Haiti. Secondly, in older maps that I found, I kept seeing a chiefdom that existed across the central and northern part of the island called Cibao. I know Dominicans today who still use this word along with Quisqueya, but personally, my father has always told me that I'm Cibaeña. I've never really known what that meant. And in modern day maps, I've never been able to find it anywhere. But through my academic research at BGC, I have a far more complete picture of what that means now. And it gives me great relief to know that some part of my family has kept their native origins alive. And I wanted to add in this cool map that I found. It was the first map created of the island. It was commissioned by the Spanish crown to Andres de Morales. And he drew this map in 1511. He was commissioned to survey the entire coastline of the island and also the land. And I just think it's incredible that he got it so close to what it is today. And, you know, I just think it's so cool because how can someone do that without having a bird's eye view of the island? I just wanted to add that in. Lastly, I came across several books that mentioned yuca and how it was the staple crop for Tainos. I've known the starchy root vegetable to be extremely important to my family's diet and other Dominicans' diets. It's provided sustenance to many generations, and it's an integral part of my project. I'm developing black and white photographs using yuca. I took a mint tea development workshop last year with the Land Art Collective. There I learned that it was possible to develop black and white film with many natural ingredients, everything from fresh mint to pasta water. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the process, after you shoot a roll of black and white film and it's taken out of the camera, it's placed into a light sealed development tank to undergo 3 different chemical baths. The first chemical bath is developer. Developer swells the gelatin coated on the film. This gelatin houses silver halide crystals, AKA the good stuff, because these crystals are what make film light sensitive and what gives film its signature grainy look. When developer reaches the exposed crystals, it changes them to pure silver metal. In the unexposed parts of the film, the crystals remain the same. You eventually remove the silver metal in the 3rd chemical bath, but developer is actually what reveals the images on film. Manufactured developer contains all these ingredients, none of which I can pronounce, nor will I try. I'm just using this. I've used mint tea as developer, and here are 2 images of mint tea. These were shot on Ilford HP5, which is just the brand, and the film was an ISO 400. ISO denotes the film speed or how sensitive the film is to light. So a lower ISO 200 and below produces a finer grain, and higher speeds 400 and above produce larger, more visible grain. But these images, and it's hard to explain it without showing you a side-by-side of what ISO 800 is developed with store-bought developer. But ISO 800 film, for me, usually turns out as grainy as this ISO 400. And ISO 400 for me, developed with store-bought developer, usually comes out less grainy than with mint tea. Now, I haven't tested pasta water, but knowing that it works, I had high hopes that developing with Juca would work. And I have no blueprint here, but so far I've tested it twice. My first time failed. This is as much of an image as I was able to get on my second try. So my second attempt worked far better. I actually got all the images on my roll, all 36. And just to go through a few, this is actually my grandma, I think about 2 years ago when she became a citizen. And ironically, also she became a citizen last, even though she was the one who brought us here. Just want to go through a couple. These are still very dark. So from here, I'll just be trying multiple recipes until I get an ideal consistency and balanced exposure, more similar to the exposure that I got with the mint tea. There are many layers to La Matriarcha on a personal level. I want to reclaim a trade that led to my life today. I want to honor a woman that gave so much of her time and strength to me. And I want to create an entirely new trade using an ingredient that defines so much of my history. I wonder, can engaging in these processes help me to reconnect to historical past that is severed, mostly lost and written by colonizers? And can this project somehow serve as a way for me to reckon with that violence? But to end this on a light note, I adopted a dog back in November, and it was because of my research at BGC that I found the perfect name for her. This is Zemi. Thank you all so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Lissy, for such a fascinating presentation. And we will now get started with the Q&A portion. And I invite our panelists to turn on your cameras and use the raise hand function. I'm going to switch to gallery view here. And all other audience members, I invite you to use the Q&A function to write in questions that we can read off. But I'm going to take the liberty, as I have been known to do, of asking the first question, Lissy. And the themes that you covered in your presentation reminded me of another interview that I heard recently by the late Irish poet John O'Donoghue, and he was talking about the difference between biography and identity, and the way that biography is sometimes mistaken for identity, and that by design, it's sort of about narrative, and it's about language, and it's reductive, and it sort of doesn't fill in all of the space that identity holds. And that the work that you're doing in the research you're doing in the library and trying to kind of piece together a narrative past the kind of scholarship that one finds in a library, runs sometimes counter to or alongside the kind of the visual work that you're doing, the kind of experiential haptic recreating of your ancestors' experience or your connection to it. And that seems to fill out the identity part. But I wondered what you thought about those two poles and how that plays out in your work at the BGC.
It's interesting because I feel like biography and identity, it certainly is biography. Even when I wrote my artist biography, felt like I had to edit out a lot of parts of myself. Identity is extremely complex. And in creating bodies of work and doing these exhibitions, I feel that it's almost representative of what creating art is, where creating art is biography, and you're trying to edit down and trying to get really focused ideas and themes into one body of work, but it isn't representative of how complex identity is. So even in doing this project, I'm editing out a lot of my past, and it's hard to do it, but it almost feels like a good practice because it feels like I'm analyzing myself in a healthy way.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from the Q&A. And this is a question from Harley. Hi, Harley. Harley was an artist in residence at BGC Library last year. And she writes, "Thank you for such a personal and beautiful talk. I love the relationship between revealing images through indigenous plants and your plan to use familial quilting lineage to collect these images. Will you use some of the maps shown in this presentation to guide your quilting design process or sewing design process?"
That's an interesting question. I was thinking of using, I don't think I was going to use maps as prints, but it is a it is a good idea now that I've discovered what that part of being Sibanya is in myself. I certainly will be using images of Zemis, like those wood sculptures that I showed, because I think it's very jarring to know that some part of my past, there were multiple deities, and now we've moved into this monotheistic dominated culture where we're the only country, the Dominican Republic is the only country in the world with the Bible on its flag. So it's just, I'm not sure if I'm going to use maps, but I like the idea. And also, hi, Harley.
Anna.
Hi, Lissy. Thank you for sharing your work and your story with us. I love seeing the connection between the natural world, not only in your work, but how you create it. And I know photography continues to become more and more high tech, while your work kind of takes the opposite approach. I was wondering if you could just discuss a little bit about the interplay between your alternative processes and technology.
That's a great question. I think about it a lot, and I discussed it a lot with my partner. But I think you could even see, just from the examples I showed, how much I'm trying to get away from using technology or using like digital cameras, which I don't even own a digital camera. So I really try to limit how much technology I'm putting into my work. And I think that stemmed from the first project I did, Take Only What You Need. It was meditative to do it, but it didn't feel like the real process to me, because there's so much when you develop film yourself that feels like you're almost painting the photos. It gives me that similar feeling. It just feels far more satisfying, or I just feel like I accomplished something every time I develop film. And I wouldn't say that film isn't a technology, but it's certainly not contemporary technology. Yeah.
Oh, Chantal.
Hi, Lissy. Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. That was really very, very powerful. I was thinking about, I think at the beginning you mentioned that you weren't sure about the longevity of the prints that you were creating. And I was thinking about how difficult conservation can be with art objects that are made with food or with substances that are unstable or won't last. And I was also thinking about how that connects to the title of your talk, which has the word erasure in it. So I was wondering if you had any further thoughts about the theme of erasure and how it connects to the way the prints are being made, and if you've done much research on like preservation or how these will age or change.
That's a great question. I've never noticed that parallel in what my talk is titled and how I approach my work. But I don't think for chlorophyll prints specifically, there are chemical baths that you can put a plant through to stop the chlorophyll from continuing to degrade. But for me personally, I like the idea of my work not lasting for a really long time. It feels very poetic to what life is, right? Where like, I know all of us won't be here for forever. So I just want to, I like exploring that part because a lot of me is terrified of dying. I like absolutely do not want to die. And I think in working with processes that eventually will degrade, I think that's how I, in a very subconscious way, try to be okay with the fact that I will not last forever.
This ties into a question in the Q&A forum from Mary that asks how the chlorophyll prints age or change over time, if they do at all. The ones that you
yeah, they change a lot. It depends. The speed on how they change varies. So if I like put a chlorophyll print that I didn't put through a chemical bath, it will lighten a lot quicker. But if you keep it in like dark, not wet conditions, then it'll degrade slower. I actually have an example. This was a lot darker. This print was a lot darker. And I've had it on the back of my phone for over a year now. So it's degrading. But that's just how it degrades. It just lightens, and eventually that image isn't on the leaf anymore. I haven't gotten to that point yet, but I am very excited to get to that point. Part of me almost wants to make that itself into a series of just letting these images on chlorophyll prints degrade and like scan them in after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years, and seeing that process just live out.
another series.
Yeah.
Karen Menenke, I see you have a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I feel like it's so moving and it's so incredible, and all the material you're finding is just blowing me away, like the map that you showed. But yeah, it's like there's so much meaning in everything, and it's almost just overwhelming for me emotionally. But my question was about, I thought it was, well, I had the question before you started talking about how developing the film is like more of a manual process. And you were saying it's almost like painting, because I was kind of thinking, oh, that the photography is less of a manual process, and now you're moving into sewing, which is going to be like super tactile. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious about like making that change, or adding the sewing in, and how you feel like that might change like your process or how you work, or how that sort of adds on to what you've done so far with photography.
Yeah, I'm certainly exploring sewing because I just want to reclaim that part of myself. that I missed out on. I don't know exactly how it would down the line show up in any of the work that I do, but with this project, it feels very pertinent to exploring my identity. And yeah, I don't know. It's funny that you would think that that developing film isn't manual, because to me it's so manual. I could like lose track of time developing film, and inclusively with juca specifically, or with any natural ingredient chemical developer, people buy it because it's like it's consistent. Like it'll always work unless you do something in the development process that messes it up. With using these natural ingredients, you actually have to develop it for a far longer time. So with developer that is store-bought, I spend like 10 minutes developing, and then with these natural ingredients, I'm spending 30 minutes, where I am watching the clock, so I'm agitating it at very specific intervals. And then sewing for me is like, I'm nervous to like start sewing because I know I'm just going to mess up in some way and not understand these patterns and how they all fit together. But that's what's exciting about it for me also. It's just knowing that like I'll have the same experience that my mom probably had when she was growing up and learning how to sew. I do hope that eventually down the line, it comes up in another body of work that I create. But for right now, I don't have like another project in mind.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a Q&A question from an anonymous attendee that says, incredible talk, Lissy. Do you know what you are striving for aesthetically with the end result of the print with yucca? It looks beautiful in its grays. What values do you think will signify that it's done? Or will you know it when you see it? Sort of, where are you in the process of?
Aesthetically, I'm striving for what the mint tea look like. So I'm searching for that grain. The images that I got with the juca are very, very flat. And again, I was using ISO 400. I was using the same film for both the mint tea and the juca. So the fact that I got a ton of visible grain from the mint tea and no grain whatsoever from the juca just signifies to me that there's something more I could be doing. I suppose that I don't have a potent enough developer with the juca yet to really get it to this balanced exposure. But I have no idea what it'll look like. And that's kind of the fun part. And the fact that I have absolutely no control of it, which is what I love about alternative process. I will never know what the end result will be, but there will be an end result somehow.
Another Q&A question from Huritya Grutsian. I'm probably mispronouncing your name, I'm sorry. But the question is, thanks for sharing your story and artwork. I was wondering what your family thinks about your exploration of family history and whether or not they're involved outside of learning to sew from your mother and grandmother.
Well, hi, Judita. She actually was a resident with me at Alterwork Studios, and she's a photographer who explores alternative process. My family is certainly involved. They know about this project. I believe some of them are watching this Zoom. So besides my mom helping me sew, I obviously speak to my grandma, not as often as I should, which they will tell me after this Zoom. I am also actually talking to my cousin in Santo Domingo who is helping me get images that I don't have access to. So I was hoping, me being hopeful last year, thought that I would be able to travel to Santo Domingo this year to photograph my grandma, and that was the original intention. But thank you, Omicron, I had to rethink what those images would be. So I landed on just using old family photographs. And luckily there are a bunch of family photographs of my grandma, my grandpa, very few of my mom, because she hates photos. And then there's a ton of photos of me because my grandma would make all my clothes and she would photograph them like it was her portfolio. So with this portfolio that my grandma has created of her work, I'm able to pull from that and know the things that like what dresses did she make me, or what shirts and pants. And so yeah, that's as involved as my family is. I don't tell them like every single thing that I'm thinking of with this project or all the research, because it's just so much to take in. But they certainly know. They also are very surprised that someone could use Juca to develop film. So that part is fun.
It makes me wonder if you, I mean, just as you're talking now, you know, it'd be interesting to incorporate a kind of oral history interview part of this process, just the happy, you know, situation that your grandmother's alive and can talk to you about her experience, and your mother and other people in your family. That feels like it'd be a compelling piece to pull in. I know you said your partner's a filmmaker, so.
Yeah. No, it was certainly the project when I thought of it was far larger than what I'm whittling it down to right now, simply because of like the things I have access to. But I did want to have a component where I interviewed my grandma and asked her all these questions that I have, because there's a lot of information about her past that I don't know about. Like, I don't know if there's any other Dominican listening, but my grandma was born during Trujillo's reign of terror, basically. She was born in a dictatorship and saw it end. So I just really wonder if growing up in that sort of violence and oppression, if that's what made her love cities and made her want to be in New York. There's a lot of questions, and I do want to do an audio component to the project.
Barb.
Hi, Lissy. Thanks so much for this beautiful talk. Very, very interesting. I know that you self-identify as an alternative process photographer, and Heather sort of introduced you as being an interdisciplinary artist. And I'm just wondering, I know that you do these beautiful line drawings and design work, and now you're going to be working on sewing. And do you see these processes as sort of an extension of photography or something else?
I see all those processes as something completely different. Admittedly, I haven't been lost, but in school, I was certainly lost, which is why I mentioned in my talk that I majored in digital design for practical reasons, because I've always known that I've wanted to be a photographer, but there's no safety in saying or pursuing that as a career. And I have a lot of friends who are photographers, but it's really the same for all of us, right? Where there's no consistency to getting work as a photographer unless you're exploring commercial work, which I have no interest in. So admittedly, my biography is old. I certainly would not consider myself an interdisciplinary artist anymore, but I certainly, what I do love is alternative process, and it is the processes themselves and exploring them. It's the thing that I love, and it's almost scary to say in a Zoom meeting that is being recorded and will live for a very long time. But that's right. Like, I think that's part of accepting being an artist, is knowing that under capitalism, I will not have a consistent income, but hopefully I will. So,
Great. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you.
And Lucille Sanders in the Q&A says, Lissy, this has been so moving and beautiful. I so appreciate and am amazed at your finding ways to develop images in a sustainable way. You are an important voice for exploring the history of your culture. How does that learning stay with us if part of it is lost because your pieces will not last forever? Just pondering this in relationship to Erasure.
It's a great question, Lucille. So with film specifically, I am using a developer that is sustainable. I am not, however, using a fixer that's sustainable. So fixer, the third chemical bath that removes the pure silver metal, that silver metal just sits at the bottom of fixer. And for me, I use my fixer to death until it absolutely does not work. So I use it way more than 2 or 3 times, which makes it less dangerous to marine life. But it's not 100% safe, even if you use it to its brink. But where was I going with this? Oh, so my photographs, the film itself will be archival. It will, as long as I store it properly, it will last. The chlorophyll prints and probably the cyanotypes on cloth won't stand the test of time as well unless they're preserved. But I think just creating access to this knowledge for me is the most important, where I do want to, my ultimate goal is to teach how to develop using Juca back home in the Dominican Republic, so that other Dominican students who are interested in photography can learn that they don't have to spend a ton of money to develop their film. And even with Fixer, it's not archival, but you could actually use salt water, and it has a lot of salt, but it actually strips that silver metal off of the film. It doesn't strip all of it, which is why it's not archival, because eventually the film will continue to expose and darken. But yeah, creating access to it is what I really want to do, which is essentially doing what the Land Art Collective does and teaching people how to use things like mint tea and coffee to develop film.
Karen, I see you have a question.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Lissy, for your talk. There's just almost too many strands for me to like pull together and like appreciate on all levels. It's incredibly rich, incredibly wonderful. What I'm thinking about a lot during this hour is another form of erasure. And you talked a lot about your experience being a researcher in the library and how the texts that you were finding are written from this colonial perspective. And there was so much that you had hoped to find and could not find in the library. And a lot of academic libraries are talking these days about wanting to decolonize the library and how to sort of fix those erasures, or like lessen different erasures for the future. And for me, I hope that in the future we'll have your work in a library. We'll have work of like the Diano Studies Instagram scholars that you mentioned. I love picturing a future where there's fewer erasures. And I wondered if you thought, if you could imagine like 50 years into the future, 100 years into the future, what kind of things could researchers find in the library that would be better?
I love that question, Karen. Just sort of interject.
No, that is a great question. I thought about it because a lot of the things that I can be certain of are based on archaeology. But even with archaeology, it's someone assessing these objects and assuming or making educated assumptions on what they were used for. So 50 years from now, 100 years from now in a library, I would hope that the work of the indigenous people of today would be somewhere in the library. And yeah, there's when I found that Diano Studies account, it just kind of reiterated to me how important it is to find that sense of community and create educational programs, art, surrounded by those people in that community who would be feeding off of each other and learning together. So yeah, I certainly do hope my work would be in the library, but yeah, realistically, I do hope that all the Dianos who feel safe now because of the conversations surrounding colonization, that they would feel safe in creating art for consumption of everyone, regardless of race and creed and color.
Yeah, and from the library perspective, it's interesting to think about what needs to change to expand, to take in and create access to such a wide variety of media and voices. And those are the conversations we're trying to have on that library side of the equation.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of Jasmine in her talk when she mentioned that all viewpoints are valid. And I've never thought of that, but when she said that, I instantly was like, wow, well, colonizers' viewpoints are valid. That would mean that also, despite the violence that they enacted, it really doesn't matter. That it was still their viewpoint, regardless of why it was their viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of an aside as we wind down this talk, but Barbara Mundy, who gave a talk here a few weeks ago, who is a scholar, a pre-Columbian scholar who works on Indigenous people in Mexico, was part of a Throughline podcast, which anyone listening might be interested in, about reconsidering the history of Tenochtitlan, which was today Mexico City. And she talks exactly about that, sort of what these different accounts, what the validity is and the weight. And but there's so much work happening now to bring out these other voices, to learn Indigenous languages and to understand all of that alongside, which does change what the future of library research might look like in fewer than 50 years, hopefully. I do want to say we're at our time at 1:15. If there are any last questions, now is the time to ask them. But we will be moving to close for today. I think that Chantal, your hand is still up, but I think that might be just a Zoom feature. So yeah, I think this brings us to a close for today. And I just want to thank you again, Lissy, for participating in the Library Air program and sharing your work. And I want to give a shout out to my colleagues behind the scenes, Laura Minsky and Jen Ha and Nadia Rivers and Maggie Walters, along with the Department of Research Collections at BGC, who have helped to bring this event to fruition today, and our tech team is so great. I encourage you, if you're not familiar with the Bard Graduate Center and all of the programming we do, to look at our website. There are online Zoom brown bag lunches and seminars and talks nearly every day of the week. So we'd love to see you at a future virtual or potentially in-person event. And please stay tuned to see Jasmine and Lissy's final projects, which will open in May. They will be installed in the library. We are hoping that we will have some in-person programming and also online programming. And I will say, in the interim, both Jasmine and Lissy will be participating in an Instagram live studio visit. So if you're interested in seeing more of their process in their studios, Jasmine being a paper maker and Lissy's alternative photo process, that will happen in early April. So stay tuned for that. So I then also thank our panelists for coming and being on screen and participating in this discussion, and to all of you for spending Friday afternoon with us. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone.